Welcome to HagueTalks, the podcast, where we hear directly from some of the HagueTalks community about how they're setting peace and justice in motion.
I'm Levan Duchidze. I am the country manager for IDLO in Ukraine.
IDLO is the International Development of Law Organization, devoted to internationally promoting the rule of law and to advancing peace and sustainable development. I'm Janet Anderson, and it's actually in the IDLO's office in The Hague that we could record this whole podcast series during the Hague Justice Week 2023. Before delving deeper into his work on corruption in Ukraine, I asked Levan how his very work and his workplace have been affected by the Russian invasion of February 2022.
I left Ukraine 10 days before the war started. I in fact, took one of the last flights that were still available. So it was mid-February 2022. And in May 2022, I already was in Ukraine on a short mission. Since then, I've been going back and forth. But about 2 weeks from now, I will be relocating permanently to Ukraine. Our staff, our team on the ground is 30 plus people. More than half of them are already in Kiev. Our office, I reopened our office when I was in Kiev last time, about a month ago. So we are fully operational there. Unfortunately, at this stage, we only have an office in Kiev. In the past, we used to have offices in Kharkiv and Odessa, and we worked very actively in 2 cities in Ukraine. One of them no longer exists, and the other one is heavily damaged, Bakhmut and Mariupol. And I very much hope that we will very soon have the opportunity to go there back and help with restoring, rebuilding both cities.
So what are the current challenges right now for rule of law in Ukraine? I can only imagine we could probably take 20 minutes just to say that, but how would you encapsulate them?
Probably the phrase that describes best what's happening in Ukraine right now is Ukraine and Ukrainians are fighting 2 wars at the same time. The first one is about physical survival, defending their country, defending their national identity and territorial integrity. And in parallel to that, they are fighting for their future, which means saving their institutions, strengthening them, and among other things, defeating the oldest enemy they've got, which is corruption, which prevents or makes it way more difficult to win, especially the second war, the second fight. But even with the first one, on the battlefield, corruption has its own ways how to make this more difficult or even impossible to win the physical war, the military conflict.
And is it that corruption is sort of stops people's trust, or corruption kind of corrodes the institutions themselves? What is it?
Everything. Even before trust, it destroys the hope that anything can be changed in a positive way. When I first professionally in this position came to Ukraine years back, one of the sayings I was hearing basically from everyone, from officials, from non-officials like ordinary people, was that Ukraine never misses a chance to miss a chance, which clearly demonstrated how deep this understanding was rooted among ordinary Ukrainians as well as public officials, that it was hopeless. These reforms, well, yeah, there were smaller groups of people who tried to implement them, but everyone knew in advance that that would not work anyways. So, what was the purpose? So, corruption destroys this hope. So, usually we tend to focus on trust and building trust and building these bridges between the society and public institutions, but you don't even get to the trust if there's no hope that anything will work. And the war now caused another serious blow to the hope, because now the question is not only whether Ukraine will ever become a prosperous Western-style, market-oriented democracy. The question is whether Ukraine will survive as a nation and whether Ukrainian national identity will survive this conflict. Now, less questions are about there. But a year ago, for instance, there was a very serious question which was asked by everyone in and outside of Ukraine. So corruption damaged whatever you can think of, what serves as a foundation for any nation or any society, any community. Corruption has its own unique and very efficient ways to undermine and destroy these foundations.
Are there programs of reform? I mean, do things kind of connect up lots of different ways of tackling this issue from lots of different people? I imagine that that's very difficult to make happen in a place that's in the middle of war.
It is difficult. It always has been difficult, even without war, because fighting against corruption, if done properly, means upsetting very powerful people. And if no one is upset, that means that something's wrong with anti-corruption. So you need a lot of wealthy, powerful, well-protected groups to be deeply upset with the situation and fight back. Only then you see that something serious is going on against corruption. So that had been a challenge even without the war. Now with the war, an additional layer of objective challenges have been added to that. Because, for instance, resources are scarce. Attention span is even more limited for the government. And honestly, I can see that from personal experience, many of the people who were huge proponents and champions in the fight against corruption, they too have found themselves in the situation where they had to shift their attention to something more urgent, something more immediate and tangible than corruption is, because you rarely can see corruption like in a 3D kind of manifestation, even though its implications are omnipresent. But when missiles are striking your residential buildings and your children are running for their life to the shelter, it is difficult to be focused on the corruption. And yet, there is an infrastructure in Ukraine that has survived. And this infrastructure is consisting of CSOs and other anti-corruption champions who are still able to find resources in them and around them to stay focused on that. What really helps also in this context is the EU accession of Ukraine, because it really provides a clear roadmap.
Well, that's what I was going to ask is, what's the vision? So the vision is basically based on the standards that the EU requires.
Right. So whether and when Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, it's a political decision which needs to be taken by the member states. So that's nothing we can influence. But where we can help, and many others can help, is bringing Ukraine first on their path and then at the point where Ukraine will be eligible, and it will be only the political decision left to be taken. So this roadmap, which covers pretty much everything, like judicial reform, good governance, it covers anti-corruption. A huge component of it is about anti-corruption. So it has all the important stuff listed in there in the accession criteria. And it helps us with the prioritization, and it serves as like a compass, because it's a more or less chaotic process at the moment, because whatever happens on the battlefield determines the agenda, the political agenda of the country, and it's pulling the country in different directions depending on how things stand on the battlefield. So this roadmap is kind of an anchor. It helps you not to lose focus and move in the right direction. For instance, the constitutional court reform. This is something, I think it's even number one in this roadmap. It is clearly defined there, and little chance exists that we would lose focus on that. The rest of the judicial reform, strengthening anti-corruption, specialized anti-corruption institutions, restoring the asset declaration system. So these are demands that are now a part of the Ukrainian commitments. So it really helps to stay focused. It really helps keeping benchmarks and comparing the progress made over time.
Your background is Georgia, and I can imagine some similarities. Do you recognize the kind of the Soviet approach that both of your countries have inherited? How does that feel to kind of work in institutions that got that accretion of an approach, of a way of doing things that's just so rigid?
Ukraine and Georgia have many differences. Ukraine is at least 10 times as big as Georgia. Also, when it comes to corruption, Georgia has a history of being the most corrupt part of the Soviet Union back then, which also led to the fact that Georgia became one of the poorest post-Soviet countries after the Soviet collapse. Also thanks to the civil war and Russian interventions back then. But and despite that, Georgia also has proven that significantly reducing corruption is possible even in the most corrupt country on more or less on the continent. So if Georgia has managed that within a few years, obviously Ukraine can manage it as well. There are differences too. Because of being small, corruption in Georgia was very much centralized, which maybe in a way made it also simpler for those fighting against it to define it and to attack it and to dismember the system. In Ukraine, corruption has always been very decentralized because of the size of the country, because of the size of the economy. And that may be also a problem with tackling corruption because it has way more diversified system and greater degree of resilience. Another difference, Georgia had and still has its own issues with oligarchs, but the number of oligarchs that existed and still exist in Ukraine clearly outnumbers any other country, probably except Russia in the region. With the war, the influence, or we can see that the influence of the oligarchs has decreased, which doesn't mean that they won't adjust and this influence will not grow back once the most intense hostilities are over. So de-oligarchization of the economy and of the politics in Ukraine is another huge challenge, which is also part, obviously, of the anti-corruption struggle. So in a nutshell, Georgia is a striking example that gives us hope that significantly, if not defeating the significantly decreasing corruption is possible, and it can be done in a relatively short period of time, and then it can be sustained. But it takes very strong political will, and it takes mobilizing all the resources that national and international resources that can help in this struggle.
What was it that kind of pulled you into this sphere to start with? What about you personally? How was it a particular experience that you had that made you think that this is the most important way to go?
My educational background and professional has been politics and diplomacy. And I think being part of this radical transformation of Georgia in 2004, 2008, I think that was an inspiration strong enough for me on a personal level as well.
What role did you play during that?
I was member of parliament. Later, I was Georgia's ambassador to Berlin. And at the final stage, I was Deputy Secretary of the National Security Council of Georgia.
But during that upheaval, what did you do?
Well, being an MP, it means that you are part of passing all the necessary legislation that creates the legal foundation for reforms, including defeating corruption. As an ambassador, my tenure in Berlin coincided with the Russian invasion in 2008, so it was less about reforms, it was about physical surviving. So that's one of the reasons why I personally resonate so much with what's happening with Ukraine now, because I was seeing that and experiencing from an extremely close distance back then, despite being physically somewhere else, but it feels still very, very similar. And as part of the National Security Council, I was mostly involved in developing the system for managing civil crises, like response to disasters and so on. This is another area which unfortunately, Ukraine will need considerable assistance with. It already needs, but it looks like this need will only grow in the immediate future. So it's I feel both professionally and personally, emotionally well positioned now to be in Ukraine and assisting with the reforms.
After hearing about the different facets of corruption in Ukraine and Levan's experience in helping to transform Georgia's approach, I asked him what role there is for The Hague and for organisations like IDLO to play. The Hague is this place where lots of discussions go on, obviously at the very justice, judicial level, international law, but also
the justice capital. Yeah,
justice capital, but lots of other conversations as well. What role do you think that The Hague plays?
It plays a huge role. Hague is hosting the International Criminal Court. This is one of the biggest topics now, both legally and politically, for Ukraine, because the first charges have been already issued against the very top level of the Russian leadership. And apparently this process will only continue. Therefore, that would be enough reason for being the central part of this legal political discussion about the accountability that is associated with the aggressive war Russia is fighting against Ukraine. But Hague also provides a broad platform for other type of less centralized approaches and discussions with all these civil society organizations and research institutions, and us being here represented with one of the largest offices. I mean, our organization. It's another demonstration how important this smaller city, speaking in physical terms, how important politically and legally this city is. So I have no doubt that The Hague, it's already playing a significant role in the accountability part, but this role will only grow. And if you speak about the Netherlands as a whole, Netherlands is one of the leading providers of assistance to Ukraine, military and non-military assistance. So this is another factor that adds additional weight to the importance The Hague already has.
Thank you, Levan Duchidze, for your insights on the challenges and also possibilities to combat corruption in Ukraine, and how this work plays an important role both in the current conflict and in planning for Ukraine's future when the war has been won. Check out all the podcasts for Hague Talks. This first collection is around Hague Justice Week, with some of the great people setting peace and justice in motion. And don't forget to like and share HagueTalks, the podcast.